Truth, logic, action, power. It's the GreggHoush Show here on New Revolutionary Radio. From the Leonard School in Malden, Massachusetts, Gregg and company are here to bring a sense of ethics to your news. Whether it's politics, activism, or current events, we always seek to inform and never to deceive. Let's start the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GreggHoush Show, episode 51. Tonight, I am joined by Mac and Mac alone. Kayla decided not to be with us tonight. It could have been something I said. Who knows? I mean, whatever, right? You know, stuff happens. So tonight, it's just the two of us, and we are going to talk about really one local thing and then all the other fun stuff we normally talk about. But I do want to start with this Massachusetts Criminal Justice Reform Bill. This is, relatively interesting in terms of the sheer amount of things it attempts to change.
Yeah,
a lot of times bills are way more targeted.
Yeah, I mean, and usually when you see a bill that's very broad in scope and does a whole bunch of things, you can usually tell that, like, oh, here's the, earmark for this congressman's district. And like,
right.
Whereas this is actually not only a fairly sweeping bill, it is actually pretty dedicated to criminal justice reform. There doesn't seem to be much that's really, or much of anything that's off topic there.
So it passed the Senate 37-0, and it passed the House 148-5. So there's 5 assholes out there in terms of this, this vote.
It's very interesting that it was, this overwhelming because criminal justice reform here in Massachusetts has been stalled for a number of years. There's been a number of groups pushing for it, and it just hadn't really gotten anywhere for a long time. But they actually spent several months negotiating this particular bill and did that in order to get pretty much literally everyone on board with it.
So this bill doesn't go far enough in a lot of respects, but it introduces changes to so many things, and basically every change is a positive. So, it's at least moving in the right direction. So this bill eliminates mandatory minimum sentences for a number of low-level drug offenses, including first and second offenses for cocaine possession, and requires district attorneys to create pre-arraignment diversion programs for veterans and those suffering from mental health and substance abuse disorders. So, they're really trying to lower, basically with this, the amount of people who actually currently are sitting in jail.
Now, they did include one target that was kind of the opposite direction of this, elimination of mandatory minimums for a lot of low-level crimes, and that's they instituted new mandatory minimums regarding specifically amounts that would be classified or could be classified as trafficking, and specifically for fentanyl and carfentanil.
Yeah, they went after, exactly what they should be going after.
The things that are causing huge opioid problems currently.
So it also reforms bail, fines, and court fees in some, interesting ways. Basically making it hard for people to be held just because they can't afford those fines.
Which is, there's been all kinds of news reports. I believe ProPublica did one a few months ago. This wasn't Massachusetts specifically, but it's a widespread issue in the United States where people are literally just going to jail because they were charged with something or sued for something or whatever.
Whether they're guilty or not.
And then couldn't afford court fees or to get time off from work or
and then they sit in jail where they're not making those fees.
Yep. And then they get out and, now there's all these fees and you have to pay them or go back to jail.
Yeah, it's a wonderful situation here. They've done a lot to reform that. They also raised the threshold for felony larceny from 250 to 1,200. So again, that that changes just by, I think, a relatively large, order here, the number of people who are going to get felony charges, which is it's a longer court case usually. It's longer drawn out. It is longer time. Dropping a good percentage of the larceny cases down to just misdemeanors is huge.
And of course, you think about this, the up until now, the threshold for a felony charge for larceny in the state of Massachusetts was something valued at $250. That's nothing. How is that a felony?
Yeah, that's
that may have been a reasonable number when they set it in 1954 or something,
right? When that was half of your car,
right? Exactly. Just due to inflation, that's the probably 1,200 is only equivalent to what 250 was when they set that last.
Right. Right. So it also creates new penalties for offenders on their 7th, 8th, and 9th OUI offenses. So if you just won't effing stop, they've decided they're coming after you again.
Since most of our listeners are probably not in Massachusetts, you may not be familiar with OUI. It's a DUI, same thing.
Yeah, here they just like using
we call
different
it
words for things.
operating under the influence instead of driving under the influence.
Yeah, they also call the RMV and the DMV.
Yes, the Registry of Motor Vehicles instead of the Department of Motor Vehicles. We got a couple of weird ones here.
Yeah, so this also helps, for the most part, people under the age of 21 years old, but it helps changes the eligibility for expungement of criminal records to multiple crimes.
It actually does help adults as well, those who are 21 or older, as long as they were originally convicted of something that's no longer illegal in Massachusetts, like the decriminalization of marijuana means that there are lots of people.
You can get that removed from your records now.
Yes.
Which is quite awesome. So this is... we're basically waiting for the governor to sign off on this thing. And his response is, I need to study it clearly. Now, it's been public for over a week, so I don't know why.
2 weeks, actually. Yeah. And it was not only was the text of the bill public, it was actually under the laws or under the requirements for the legislature in Massachusetts. Lawmakers actually couldn't change the text at that point.
So, I'm hoping that people look at this bill as steps in the right direction.
Yeah, this is the beginning of what.
Start to lower the jail population, start to introduce various diversion programs to help people out instead of just punish them, to get people off of also, just the revolving door of I go in, I go out. I mean, the recidivism rate is horrible. The other states should be looking at this in a few years and seeing how successful it was. And I'm hoping, that it is. I mean, everything that we know, everything that we've been complaining about for years in terms of prison and jail reform, this is starting in that direction. It's nowhere near enough, but it is an interesting start that we should be able to pull some really cool stats and analytics out of that other states can then use to introduce the same bills.
It is, however, it's kind of interesting to me that, this bill just passed in the Massachusetts legislature after years of being stalled, or similar legislation being stalled. And the reason it's interesting to me is because, of course, just back in November 2016, Philadelphia elected a new district attorney who ran expressly on the platform of criminal justice reform and is using all of the powers of the district attorney's office to push every aspect of criminal justice reform he can. And so we're seeing
actually
these two,
amazing.
Oh yeah, doing a fantastic job from everything I've seen. But it's just very interesting that we're suddenly, after all these years of no progress, or often even backward, like regression to worse situations, suddenly we have two different places taking two different but kind of similar approaches, one the legislative approach and one the more executive approach to trying to address some of the issues with criminal justice.
So there we go. Let's hope that Charlie Baker signs this, and let's revolt with pitchforks if he doesn't.
Sounds like a plan.
So the Surgeon General has put out an advisory, a national advisory, the first one since 2005.
Yes.
It's been a while. So these things are relatively important when they're done.
They don't come out all that often.
They kind of hold off until they feel it's really necessary to do this.
Oh, and just to note, the one that came out in 2005, just to be clear, was the one where they suggested that pregnant women avoid alcohol entirely.
Yeah, really, it was important that you say it, but how dumb are you?
2005?
How
Seriously?
dumb are you to still be drinking at that point?
I mean, they'd already issued one almost 30 years before, or 20 something years before, I believe. That was the one where they suggested that women who are pregnant, maybe take steps to monitor and limit their alcohol consumption. Yep. So that's how infrequent these are.
So this one was specifically about the use of naloxone. And that is the drug used to basically revive and stop someone who is currently overdosing. It's kind of a miracle drug when you see it work. I've seen it work, and I've seen someone get it just right up the nose, the spray version of it, and they're turning blue, they're shaking. You can see they've got minutes. You spray this in their nose, and minutes later, they're kind of sitting up. They're still a little stressed, but they're looking you in the eye and the color's coming back. It's surprising what this can do to save lives. And so the Surgeon General has said that he is encouraging Americans to learn to use and keep on hand the opiate overdose treatment naloxone. And he also said, each day we lose 115 Americans to an opioid overdose. That's one person every 12.5 minutes. It is time to make sure more people have access to this life-saving medication because 77% of the opioid overdose deaths occur outside of a medical setting and more than half occur at home. Now, here at our office, where we record this and do all our other kind of activities to pay the bills around here, we actually have this sitting in our closet, and it's been pointed out to everyone. So if this ever happened in our office, God forbid, or near us, it's within reach.
Yeah, and I mean that's not because we expect it to ever be an issue. It's just because it's a very reasonable precaution.
At this point,
yeah.
It's sad that it's a reasonable precaution, but in this day and age,
it's like just having a first aid kit around.
Yeah, exactly. It's literally just part of a standard first aid kit at this point. So, I would agree with the Surgeon General here. I mean, anyone who wants to, you can get this stuff now at CVS's. You can get it at your normal pharmacies, but for women out there carrying big purses, just keep one in there. For people with, cars with a lot of room, keep one in your glove box. You never know when you're going to run into someone doing this, but with the sheer number of people who are overdosing and the seeming randomness of where they're doing it,
better to just be ready for that.
You can save a life.
Yeah.
You can save a life. So that was, after that long to release another one, I'm surprised that I completely agree with the person. And B, I'm surprised that it's actually, really targeted at a current real problem.
Yeah, that's not something we typically see much of from this administration.
Or from our government in general, but,
Fair enough.
So on to Sinclair Media. I
think everyone's at least heard the basics of this story.
So most people probably hadn't heard of Sinclair, though, in terms of just the general public until relatively recently, because they hide behind all these other names. And by that, I mean, normally something that you're watching that happens to be Sinclair might be your local ABC, or it might be your local Fox or NBC or CBS, because
they own all of those.
Yeah, they own affiliates for all of them and multiple others.
And there's about a 1 in 3 chance that your household gets a Sinclair media station if you live in the U.S.
So earlier this week, it was revealed that Sinclair Broadcast Group was requiring reporters to air pre-scripted segments, criticizing, quote, irresponsible one-sided news stories plaguing our country, and also, quote, sharing of biased and false news. And, I mean, seriously, everything about what they do here is biased and false news.
If you
they're criticizing if you biased and false news
at just the statement, in isolation, it's not that the specific text of that statement.
If any one station had done it locally on their own, that would have been a decent statement.
Right.
However,
but this is being handed down by corporate control to tell them you are being mandated to read this exact statement on the air like it was your words.
Yep.
But it gets worse than that because of the fact that they're accusing other people
of doing exactly what they're doing.
And to be clear, Sinclair Media has been forcing their stations to air these must-run packages for a while, which is actually a fairly standard thing, except for the details of the content they're forcing them to air. A number of these must-run packages that they've been forcing all of their local affiliates to run include pro-Trump commentaries by Boris Epshteyn, who was previously a senior advisor to the Trump campaign, then worked as a special assistant in the Trump administration, and is a personal friend of Eric Trump's. And then another time, they ran a segment featuring Nazi Seb Gorka complaining about the deep state. These are the worst people to be accusing anyone of misrepresenting or irresponsible one-sided news stories, because they are literally having corporate push out bullshit stories to all of their affiliates with no notification that this is corporate control.
So most of the news we have from inside of Sinclair, media and owned stations comes anonymously, because Sinclair, being the giant corporate behemoth that it is, has found ways to work very interesting clauses somehow legally into employment contracts that in I think a few states might not hold muster. But
in some states they wouldn't, but you can bet that anyone that tried to challenge them would be tied up in court for years with legal fees they can't possibly afford because they were working at, their local TV affiliate.
Right. So, not only would they be risking their current livelihoods if they talked, but the contracts often have non-compete agreements and penalty clauses that could prevent them from being able to obtain other jobs, while simultaneously being forced to repay Sinclair up to 40% of their previous annual pay.
So you were making, $50,000 a year, right? As a newscaster on your local affiliate. Now you talk shit publicly about, this, and you lose your job because they fire you outright. And then you have a non-compete agreement, so you can't get another job in your industry. And then they might sue you to make you repay $20,000 to them now that you no longer have a job and can't get one in your field.
And, you can pay them the 20 or you can pay a lot more for how long they keep you in court.
Right.
So either way, it's
Plus
a lose.
all of the stress involved.
So either way, it's a lose.
Yeah, no, you are just
So
fucked.
No one's going on the record but people who have already left and already have other jobs, or people who are going on the record or off the record completely, like anonymously. And so Justin Simmons is a morning TV producer at a Sinclair-owned station in Nebraska. Or was. He resigned in response to this specific corporate directive to give this statement. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't produce it. He wanted out. And, another former employee, this one, Aaron Weiss, a former news director at Sinclair, for Sinclair in Sioux City, Iowa, quote, "Across the entire company, I can tell you there's very little respect for the must-run pieces." And, when you look at all of this, it really speaks of the bigger problem of media consolidation, where we see all of the small, supposedly local media channels, be them television, radio, whatever, being bought up by, huge entities. For TV, this is, really Sinclair at this point, although other people have attempted it. Sinclair kind of owned that.
Yeah.
For radio, you have Clear Channel. Mm-hmm. And, it's just... It's a problem. It's a big problem.
One of the most serious parts of why it's such a problem is that you get the impression that you're hearing a diversity of views from, a variety of local sources. It seems like it's all independent, and it gives the impression that like there is, some sort of widespread popular opinion or public opinion, or that this view is credible, when it's really just the corporation telling their employees that they need to spread whatever messaging the corporation wants.
So the chairman of Sinclair Broadcast Group, David D. Smith, fought back against the criticisms in an email exchange with the New York Times. And he asserted that what his company did was no different from when networks require their affiliates to run must-run content. So we're talking NBC or CBS requiring the local NBC or CBS to run a specific thing, like news programming or late-night talk shows.
Yeah. So he's trying to compare outright propaganda to just standard network-wide
you're
content.
only on NBC because you want NBC's content. So yes, here's the stuff that you have to run to be an NBC.
Right.
That's like literally like if CBS didn't make their affiliates run Stephen Colbert's show, like no, you're a CBS, you run Stephen Colbert's show. Like that's the thing.
If you're an affiliate, if you're your local CBS affiliate, but whoever owns that particular affiliate can be like, you know what? We don't want to do that. We're no longer a CBS affiliate. If you're a Sinclair-owned station, you don't get a say. Sinclair owns you. They are your bosses. You can't just be like, well, we don't want to be part of the Sinclair Content Network, so we're not going to do that.
No, you just lose your job at that point.
Yeah.
And they hire someone else who will.
Right, because they own the fucking station.
So this needs to be fought on every front. A lot of this can be fought at the FCC, of course, but we all know Ajit Pai just works for his own interests. And those interests are not our interests.
Yes.
Although so have many others at the FCC who have allowed this to go on for decades.
Yeah, he is perhaps a bit of a lightning rod in that he's so good at making it so clear as to what an asshole he is, whereas most of the time the people doing this shit just get ignored.
Yeah, like Wheeler before Ajit Pai, you could see, kind of bad, but, then you see Ajit Pai and he's like literally staring at you laughing making jokes about the fact that he's doing exactly what you're telling him he's doing. Subtle difference there. Slight difference. Like one's doing it in the back room, the other one's doing it in the back room, then coming out and telling you what he just did and laughing at you because you can't stop him.
Yeah. Also, we didn't have like all these things where like Wheeler was going and like, meeting with Verizon executives and Comcast executives like, look at these assholes. They can't do anything to stop me. And Pi, we keep hearing about things like that.
Yeah, so let's hope the FCC gets some changes, but
or at least the FTC or something gets involved.
I don't have any actual hope for either of them.
No, I don't, and we know that like none of the antitrust laws or anything like that are being enforced at this point. They haven't been for decades.
So yeah, Sinclair sucks. Everyone should go tell everyone they know that Sinclair sucks. On the internet, everyone should join in on the various, threads of people talking about it and spread the word.
And you can easily find a list of stations owned by Sinclair. So...
And stop watching Sinclair networks.
Yeah.
You can literally just, on some set-top boxes, you can even remove channels from your guide so you don't see them anymore. You can take the list of Sinclair-owned stations and just remove them all one at a time from your guide so they just don't pop up anymore. And I would recommend that. In fact, that should be a thing that the internet gets behind and teaches people how to do. And
I'm on board for this.
Maybe someone gets on that. Maybe we put up a page. Who knows? Let's move on to the maybe trade war.
I mean, at this point, it seems kind of like it's an incipient trade war since both sides are actively participating.
Well, so we are, in all visible and kind of, all noticeable ways in a trade war with China right now.
I mean, we announced, well, I say we, but
Donald
Trump announced tariffs. China announced retaliatory tariffs. Trump announced more tariffs. China announced more retaliatory tariffs. And just tonight, Donald Trump is now talking about even more tariffs.
Yeah, but then at the same time, Trump tweets something that I think is somewhat true, and that one, even an iota of truth in his tweet blows my mind.
Yeah, very unusual.
So Trump tweeted, quote, "We are not in a trade war with China. That war was lost many years ago by the foolish or incompetent people who represented the United States." Now, maybe foolish and incompetent and wrong. Maybe they were just, greedy, and so they were lining their own pockets by allowing this to happen. But he's not wrong that we lost in that trade war. We lost everything in that war. There was nothing gained by the U.S. people in terms of how we lost our factories, how we lost these huge swaths of our economy's actual skill sets, that we don't even have enough schools to teach again anymore because there weren't enough people coming to those schools because there weren't enough jobs left. So literally we've lost entire skill sets out of this country down to the point where there's those few artisans who still remember how to do it. But for the most part, you can only find enough staff to even build that factory in China these days.
And of course,
we lost. We lost. He's right there. But
we gained quite a bit in terms of lowered prices, but how did we gain that? We gained that at the expense of having many of the industries that supported many of the communities that needed those jobs to be able to buy things in the first place. That's why we have so many, or a big part of the reason we have so many problems in the Rust Belt.
The exploding middle class that happened in terms of just growth and job quality and job security after World War II is very related to the machine work and factory work and other jobs from basically the Rust Belt that really gave a lot of those men and their children and women who came home from that war something to do. And it led to this big explosion by even the middle 70s of a gigantic middle class that hadn't existed before in that way.
Yeah.
And as soon as we started losing that trade war, I mean, sure, the middle class was already going to start losing out because the rich weren't too happy with the fact that all of a sudden these people were comfortable. Yes. It's not good for the rich if the middle class is comfortable. But as soon as China started playing this game and the greedy Americans who knew they could profit from it allowed it to happen.
We
all lost.
I put less of the blame on China than the bad intentions of the people that were responsible for negotiating these trade deals in the first place.
Oh, of course. China was just looking out for its own. That's what you do.
I mean, ultimately,
and I'm not a fan of their policies or politics or politicians. I'm just saying, if you're China, you look out for your own. However, if you're America, like those people were representing, they didn't.
Yeah, and they simply didn't care. It was all about, fundamentally, we're talking about people who, realistically speaking, don't really have much loyalty to the concept of a country or nation state or whatever you want to call it, because their loyalty is to their own personal wealth. If it means that they can buy a, plot of land or a plot of land in China to build a factory for dirt cheap where, they will be making 90% of the wealth, but that increases the US trade deficit and, if it somehow very specifically harms the US as a whole for them to be able to build that one factory by 100 times as much as they could ever hope to make from it, it's still a trivial choice for them to make to build that factory because they still personally benefit from it.
And they will build that factory every time.
And even if they don't personally benefit from it,
and China will help them build that factory.
Exactly. And, sure, China isn't getting most of the money from that once you actually look at how it all shakes out. But compared to where they were before, it's still advantageous to them. Or at least, to the people in charge of making those decisions in China, which is not necessarily congruent with the Chinese population, much as the situation is in the US, that the people making the decisions not necessarily doing so in the interest of the populace.
So where we stand now is the version of a trade war we are currently fighting is basically positive for no side. These tariffs only affect basically the amount of people who can be employed in the industries who actually are now hit by the tariffs, the amount of money they can be paid, and the amount of their product that's getting bought. It's not going to affect many people at the top. It's this stuff, when people talk about trickle down, the money never trickles down, but the pain does.
Yeah.
The pain comes, it actually kind of starts in the middle.
It pours, and none of it stays at the top.
And so, we do need to do something about the trade deficit. Absolutely. That is not a Republican issue. I'm not on the right. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a fiscal conservative. But we have to solve the trade deficit if we're going to financially survive. We just don't have to solve it this way.
I don't necessarily agree. I don't think the trade deficit itself matters all that much. It can sometimes represent other things in the economy that can be of concern, but in absolute terms, the trade deficit itself doesn't really mean anything, especially when you realize that like half the time that trade deficit could be as a result of money flowing to a holding company in another country that is actually owned by a US based corporation that like all of the stockholders are Americans.
Sure, but then you're talking about stockholders, and stockholders in the United States of America make up less than 15% of the population.
Oh, absolutely, and 1% of the population owns like 60% of the stock.
Yeah, so you're not helping the people.
No, it's not helping America as a whole, but
and they're not spending most of their money in our economy either. So again, it's not.
Yeah, but
it's not a positive that doesn't.
I'm
help
not saying that it's a positive.
The argument.
I'm saying that the actual magnitude of the trade deficit, or even the existence of one, doesn't mean anything on its own right.
I could see that, but it speaks to a lot of larger problems that solving the trade deficit would definitely mean you have solved those problems.
Well, at least implies you might have.
I don't see you solving it without. We need more jobs at better pay. We need to be making more of this stuff at home, using it here, and shipping more of our stuff out in order to better support our people, our population, to better support the social safety nets we have, everything else that we have here. And so the trade deficit itself might not just as a number be that meaningful, but as a number it is an indicator of all of those existing problems.
Right, but you could have no trade deficit but still have the problems. And meanwhile, I honestly don't think that necessarily manufacturing is absolutely the answer. It might be a part of the answer. I'm not gonna say for definite where the answer is there, but from what I see, manufacturing fills an essential role in the economy where it is productive enough that it can provide decent compensation and, people can support a family off of the productivity of a manufacturing job. And it doesn't require a necessarily extremely high skill set. Whereas a lot of what we would think of as good jobs that do exist in America now.
Well, knowledge work.
Our knowledge work, and they're very hard to get into because you need training, and then once you have the training, you're starting out as a
junior who needs
maybe
experience.
You can get a job, or maybe you're at a situation where the people with 5 years of experience are competing for those jobs, and just like it can be very hard to break into these. And you have to go for a very long time while accruing college debt and all this stuff, and it's just not easy for people who aren't already well off to get to a middle-class lifestyle. And manufacturing is one possible solution there. Obviously worked
Lots
well.
of blue-collar work did that for a lot of Americans, and that work is now gone.
And
now, we also have the problem of if the factories even come back, how many humans are actually going to be needed to run them anymore?
Right.
With,
so many of the job losses haven't even been because of the factories going overseas.
It's
just because of automation.
Automation. So, there's a whole just heap of subjects here that, could be expanded upon. But
Absolutely.
for me personally, I really do see the trade deficit as meaningless as itself. It's just a number that, tells a story. But to me, that story is important. And that story is that more money is leaving and more value is leaving and less money is coming in and less jobs exist over here and less stability exists over here. That's the story I see from that deficit.
Yeah. I guess my big problem is I think of it much in terms of the conversation about, the national debt in general, where people are like, we're $20 trillion in debt. And I'm like, that doesn't fucking matter. That's not the point.
Yeah. That's kind of a number. Like, do you think we're paying that back or something? Like,
right. Like, that has fuck all to do with anything.
You know that collector that calls you and you realize that, he's trying to collect a debt that he legally can try, but you legally don't have to pay back anymore? That's how I think of the national debt.
I mean, there are situations in which the national debt could be a real problem. It's just very specific context. And like underlying, the issue isn't, oh no, we spent X amount in absolute terms. It's, oh no, we blew a shitload of money on dumb shit that didn't provide any benefits.
Yeah. It's totally about the Joint Strike Fighter.
Right.
It's totally about these various jets that our military seem to want to try and make that we don't need anymore, and that go billions, hundreds of billions of dollars over budget. And all of that money, literally like $300 billion, solves most of the homelessness crisis in America. And instead we have a plane that's still not really flying right.
Yes. It's sold like a third of the number that they're like all of their projections.
And that's the
involved.
story that the national debt tells.
Right.
So, the trade war is on, even though Trump says it isn't. But I do kind of agree with him that we very much lost that. And, we're not at war yet, even with the moves he's making. I just don't think the moves he's making are good ones. They're not going to help. They're just going, the only thing you can do in this type of a war is one up the other person over and over. There isn't an end game until you guys finally hurt each other enough that you both say uncle together, because neither of you are saying it alone. They're not going to back down, and they have a stockpile enough to easily outlast us in terms of financial, in terms of other people taking, heck, Russia will step in if we stop buying enough of China's stuff and take the excess just to screw us in this fight.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, we have...
And plenty of other countries just wouldn't give a shit.
And it's bad. Like, I think the entirety of the BRIC nations, Russia, Brazil, China, India, would probably support that side of this fight just at our expense on purpose. And,
pretty much.
That deals us a really interesting blow in this fight because... there aren't many other economies other than, say, Germany, who might on our side be able to back us up in that same way.
Now, there's also another issue here that's kind of interesting, and interestingly enough, relates back to the whole thing with the national debt, because one of the ways that we really can get screwed in terms of the national debt is if people are no longer willing to buy the debt that the U.S. government issues in the form of bonds. Well, it turns out that over $1 trillion of U.S. public debt is owned by China.
Yeah.
So if they want to dump all of that on the market, they could hurt us quite a bit.
Yeah, and that's why they have it, by the way.
Yeah.
That's the
I
only
mean,
point. They don't need it.
No, I mean,
It's a political weapon.
They're making a fair bit of money off of it
Sure,
overall.
they're making their interest, but they are, and they've
I
got
mean,
it.
bond interest, so
Yeah,
it's a joke, but
bond interest on that much, it's
yeah,
still.
and also when you don't buy bonds because you're trying to make a profit off of it. You're doing it because you're trying to hedge your bets on future stability.
Indeed. So that's going to be fun to watch as everyone gangs up on the other side of this one. I really think that's what's going to happen. I mean, if China even starts to flinch, Russia steps in and stabilizes their side of it, and then we're up against Russia and China on that one. Now we're lucky in a respect that when it comes to say a war, it's really easy to invade either of them. And it's nearly impossible to invade America.
Yes.
Many studies have been done, even recently, with military officials from all over the world, where they tried to have people actually plan out invading America. And in terms of just the actual geography of our country alone, even though we have these long borders on the top and on the bottom and these huge seaboards, it's nearly impossible for even the most modern of militaries to actually land troops on our land.
I mean, there are like 3 different levels of impossibility involved.
Yeah.
First of all, amphibious landings are incredibly hard. Multiple armies and navies work together to make the largest amphibious landing in history on D-Day, and they still barely pulled it off despite having years of experience with amphibious landings. And complete air control and sea control. And
complete confusion on the other side as they believed it was coming somewhere else and had almost all of their troops at a different location.
Right, and to make that
even worse... And we still barely made it.
To make that even worse... That was only crossing the 20-mile wide portion of the English Channel.
Yeah, these people have to land here across the Atlantic or the Pacific.
Yeah, that's the first challenge. That would be virtually impossible in its own right. There is no country on the planet. Our Navy wouldn't let them get within
100 miles of our landing, let alone anything else.
Before you even take into consideration our Navy, the capabilities of the U.S. Navy, it's effectively impossible to do that kind of scale of amphibious landing.
Yeah.
You would have to be, first of all, the preeminent military power in the world.
That's us.
And then develop a navy specifically to support that. And then it would still be all but impossible. Right. Just due to the distance.
So with all of that, and there's another big, long story there. And there's actually a couple really cool articles. One of them's on Vice where they talk about the possibility of invading America. And they talk about, you can't come in through Canada because... on the right-hand side over here on the eastern seaboard, you've got a small gap between the ocean and the Great Lakes that is relatively easy for us to maintain. On the other side of that, you've got all of the Great Lakes all the way over until you get into some really rough land that is a smaller patch that we need to maintain. But then you get into the forests on the west coast there that are so large and so dense that the strongest force you could get through there is ground infantry alone running through the woods. So
you're going to be spending months with bulldozers and shit to get any armor through there.
So you have all these problems coming there. And then the Mexican border is actually small enough that we can maintain. And we've got some of our largest bases that the United States actually controls within range of that. Fort Hood down in Texas is, they're just going to hop in their trucks and drive a few hours and then say hi,
Plus, that's a border that's in the middle of a desert where tons of people die trying to get across there every year just due to nature.
Right. So militarily, I think we're in pretty good shape to survive here, but economically, if we want to have this war with China and these other people who have been trying to mess with our economy, mess with our stability, divide us as a nation, decide to come in and bolster China's side, no matter how big the war gets, we are on, I don't like to admit it, but possibly the losing side of that battle.
Yeah. And I mean, you said, these countries have been trying to do this to us. Well, that is true, but it's very important to note that they have very strong motives for doing so. Not just, jealousy of the United States or whatever, but the fact that we've done the exact same thing to all of them.
Yeah, nonstop.
So from their perspective, this is just like self-defense.
It's just fair play. It's
sure.
Eye for an eye.
Yeah, like we've talked many times on the show about all the shit Russia has done, but we also know perfectly well that from Russia's perspective, like this isn't really all that different from what they're accustomed to both sides doing. It's, a little bit, but most of this is pretty standard according to their view of how that interaction has gone.
So that's what I'm calling right now. I haven't seen anyone really talking about, but I'm calling this. If this war ramps up enough that either side has to flinch, and it becomes their side, the first time China thinks about flinching, Russia steps in.
And I just don't see the any of the U.S.'s traditional allies and partners being that interested and dedicated to stepping up on the U.S.'s side here. They don't really support the fight in the first place.
Yeah.
And the U.S. current administration has done pretty much everything it can to alienate all of them. So at this point, they're pretty much all just like, fuck those guys.
There we go. That is going to be a fun one to watch, and we will keep watching and see who flinches first. But it's not a good thing.
No one's winning this.
So Trump is not a target of the Mueller investigation, but a subject. And these two words are very important in terms of how the DOJ works. They have very different meanings.
Well, sort of. Specifically under...
They are very different because one means you are absolutely a thing and one means you might be a thing.
The DOJ usually, as part of an investigation, classifies people as one of three things. You can be a witness, someone who is relevant observations to the topic of the investigation, but is not believed to have been involved in any criminal activity, isn't suspected of being in any criminal activity. They just believe they may have seen or heard something. Then there is a subject. A subject is a person whose conduct is within the scope of the investigation, but that they haven't specifically identified them as being a person that they have linked to the commission of the crime with substantial evidence and is, in the judgment of the prosecutor, a defendant. However, it's actually a little fuzzy because, for example, in this case, there's a lot of questions about whether the president can be a defendant in a criminal case.
He believes he can't.
And the longstanding policy of the Department of Justice is that the president cannot be prosecuted.
And a lot of scholars out there, specifically judicial and law-related scholars, are saying that's, just kind of tradition, and that it's actually not entirely true, and they can be prosecuted.
In fact, back in the special counsel in the 90s under Kenneth Starr, their office issued a memorandum to the effect that they believed that there was legal precedent sufficient to make the argument that the president could be criminally prosecuted. That's never been tried in court, but
definitely there are people out there much smarter than us on this subject saying that, yes, it can be true. And then there's an idiot on the other side named Donald Trump saying that you can't prosecute me.
But there are also plenty of legal experts, and the longstanding legal consensus is that is the case. The president can't be criminally prosecuted. You have to impeach him and remove him from office first. It's not definite. It's never come to a court case, but that is the widespread view. But assuming that the Mueller team holds that perspective, then of course the president can never be a target of an investigation because he can't be a putative defendant.
Right.
So
he's always a subject.
Yeah. So the fact that the Mueller team told Trump's attorneys that he was a subject rather than a target doesn't necessarily mean anything because of that. There's also the fact that they can lie.
Yeah.
If you're not in court,
the Department of
prosecutor
Justice,
can lie.
Prosecutors are allowed to lie to you. They inspect kind of what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. And in fact, the Department of Justice guidelines about notifying targets of investigations specifically lays out circumstances in which the prosecutor is not supposed to notify a target. It says, quote, notification would not be appropriate in routine clear cases or when such action might jeopardize the investigation or prosecution because of the likelihood of flight, destruction or fabrication of evidence, endangerment of other witnesses, undue delay, or otherwise would be inconsistent with the ends of justice. So, for example, if you thought that maybe the president had committed some criminal wrongdoing, but that the president would shut down your investigation if he understood that he was a target of the investigation, then the Department of Justice guidelines expressly tell them not to tell the target of the investigation.
And for anyone wanting to look it up, that is 9-11 period 151. Advice of rights of grand jury witnesses.
Well, that's the one that defines what constitutes a target.
153 is this one.
153 is the one on
153, notification of targets.
Yes, on notification of targets.
Yeah, so both of those are pretty good reads if you can stomach that type of language. But
it's genuinely not a particularly long read just to read those sections.
Yeah, so
paragraphs.
so he is a subject, not a target, or maybe he's still a target,
and
but
it doesn't really fucking matter. You call
non-notified
whatever you
target.
want.
Yeah.
He might still. They could firmly believe that he is 100% guilty,
Well,
and
I'm
then they
with
could
Rex
prove it.
Tillerson on this one, and that's the only time in my life I'm ever going to say that. He's a moron.
Yeah, fucking moron.
A fucking moron.
I think we need to be specific there.
So, today Trump did something funny.
Speaking of fucking morons.
Today he was, at a round table about taxes in West Virginia, and he was supposed to talk about taxes.
He had prepared remarks.
And these prepared remarks sitting in front of him, he looks down at the prepared remarks and then says, this was going to be my remarks. It would have taken about 2 minutes, but to hell with it. That would have been a little boring. And then he threw the prepared remarks. He just threw them.
Tossed them into the air.
And then decided to talk about rape.
Didn't he decide to talk about?
And he got all of that wrong, of course.
Yeah.
And then he decided to talk about, when an immigrant has a baby on our land and the baby becomes a U.S. citizen because of it, and agreed that that was true, but then said no other country has that.
And that we shouldn't do that.
And that we shouldn't do that.
I just want to note that 35 other nations have that exact policy.
The thing that he said today that nobody else had.
Right, which there are currently 195 nations in the world, so 36 out of 195. I'll let you do the math. I think that's a little more than no one else.
Yeah, so he also insisted, quote, in many places like California, the same person votes many times. You've probably heard of that. They always like to say, oh, well, that's like a conspiracy theory. Not a conspiracy theory, folks. Millions and millions of people, and it's very hard because the state guards their records. They don't want to see it. So that's end quote there. So that's him lying outright. We know the facts.
We've been over this repeatedly since he was
out
elected.
of hundreds of millions of votes ever cast in this country, there are literally only it was like 300 or so confirmed cases of fraud in the entirety of it?
It's like when they last did an investigation into this, they looked at, I don't remember the exact number, but it was several billion ballots cast over decades in the United States. And they had confirmed literally like 36 cases of in-person voter fraud.
Yeah, so that's a little less than millions.
Also,
in fact, it's a little less than even statistically relevant.
We've had...
in fact, it's a little less than zero, like 0.00000 something percent.
We've actually heard about a number of cases where people did, in fact, illegally vote multiple times in the 2016 election. But strangely enough, I think one of those cases wasn't someone voting for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
What a coincidence.
So he just, it was definitely funny to watch when he threw the papers. That was interesting. But then he moved on to say that the military is going to be building some of the border wall. And sure, there's a proposal to improve defense around a bombing range on the Mexican border. But the idea that the military is really allowed to act in some of these ways is a little wrong. Now, the National Guard has a very interesting kind of set of rules around what it's allowed to do in America. So one, he's talking about them being called up to guard the border. In actuality, a lot of them do spend time on that border, but they aren't armed and active in order to, go use those weapons. They are allowed to carry, but as defense only. And they aren't actually supposed to be guarding.
In fact, that would be a function of law enforcement.
Yes.
And the military...
The National Guard can only back up law enforcement when called in as well.
Yeah,
but the National Guard
and that has to be done by, I believe, the only way to actually make that legal I'm not 100% sure on this. I know governors can do it with an emergency order.
Correct.
But I don't know that there's any provision for the federal government to do so. I believe the Posse Comitatus Act actually prevents that.
It's very clear that the state's governor has to do the call. Now, here's the other interesting part about that. If the National Guard wants to do anything on U.S. soil, there's lots of things they can do. And they do lots of interesting support roles. And they also will partner with other military to borrow their resources to then use them on U.S. soil, which, it's weird. Like the military doing stuff here off of their bases is, frowned upon at best.
Yes.
But the Army Corps of Engineers can get called up in states of emergency, and boy, do they! I mean, look at Hurricane Katrina, look at everything else. The Army does have personnel on the ground working outside of their bases all over America.
I mean, the Army Corps of Engineers is constantly maintaining the system of levees and dikes on the Mississippi River.
Exactly. But they aren't guarding the border, which is much less infrastructure and support and much more.
Law.
Yeah. It's a subtle difference. One is law enforcement. One is infrastructure repair, basically.
Literal national defense.
Exactly. So, the idea that he could, and somehow kind of air quotes, deploy the National Guard to the border is idiotic. But the idea that if we had some kind of national defense wall there, that he could actually get them, and by extension, the Army Corps of Engineers to have to work on it, actually not outside of the question. That's a thing that they could possibly pull off,
right?
Given the Republican governors all along that border and everything else. But at the same time, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Even the Republicans aren't
too many hoops to jump through, and the Republicans aren't for this. He's just, again, lying to people about the border wall.
And speaking of lies, another thing from his speech, he claimed that next April you're going to, in many cases, one page, one card. This is the last time you'll have to file a very big and complex tax form. Now, of course, this has been a long time talking point from Republicans about making the tax code simple enough that you can file your taxes on a postcard, which is, of course, absolutely stupid. The way you file your taxes on a postcard isn't by simplifying the tax code so you can fill out your taxes on a postcard. It's by making it so the government does your taxes for you and sends you a postcard that asks, is this information correct?
And they actually have all of the data to do so.
Yeah.
And it would streamline what they do.
A number of other countries do that.
Yeah. And it would streamline what they do so much that it would actually cut their costs. These studies have been done.
Yes. However, a number of companies like H&R Block have spent an enormous sum of money lobbying the government to make sure that will never, ever happen in any way, shape, or form, simplifying your tax filing because they outright profit off of making sure that it's tough enough that you have to hire someone.
So again, corporate profits over the American people.
Or even the most basic values of a democracy.
Indeed. So, at a news conference on Thursday today, that Trump was asked if he knew about the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels made by Michael Cohen. And he actually broke his silence for the first time and answered this question instead of dodging it. And he said no. And he tried to move on, but reporters pressed, and Trump insisted, you'll have to talk to Michael Cohen. Michael is my attorney. You'll have to ask Michael. But that no is important because Stormy Daniels' lawyers have been arguing in court that they need the non-disclosure agreement to be basically nullified because it's not enforceable. Trump did not know, and this is in his name, and only he can enforce it. So this is not a legal document.
Yes.
Well, he just admitted that they're right. He did not know. So there you go.
Thanks.
So I just am now waiting for the new filing from her lawyers.
Yeah.
There you go.
And, once again, we'll see another case where something goes to court, and one of the key factors in judging the legality of something regarding this administration is the court looking at Donald Trump's own words to undermine his legal argument.
Things that his lawyers have told him not to say. That actually could be a good Jeopardy category.
They wouldn't run out of material for a long time.
No, that could be like Potent Potables. It ran for 10 years? They could definitely pull this one off. So, I think that's the show for tonight. That's all the fun bits. Next week we're hoping to have a pretty cool guest on. So join us then. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at GreggHoush Show and on Instagram at GreggHoush. If you like what you've heard and want to be a part of it, check out patreon.com/GreggHoush Show. In exchange for funding our programming, you gain access to exclusive content such as uncut editions of our podcast. We have new episodes every Thursday night. We hope you listen in. The GreggHoush Show was created by GreggHoush, executive produced by co-host Eric Gowrays, and co-hosted by Kayla Avery. Other contributors include producer and writer Anna Geoffroy, co-host producer David McGuffin, and writer-engineer Robert Tortora. Theme music for this show was produced and recorded by Geneva de Colbert. Our interns include co-host Casey McLaughlin, writer-engineer Alec Greeny, writer Maddie Locicero, and associate producer, writer, and announcer William Kennedy. You're listening to New Revolutionary Radio, your call to action.